bolt shell fragments are still embedded in the crimson ceramite when my fingers find them. Tiny slivers of metal that survived the impact that killed 3 orcs and covered Brother Sergeant Aramis in Xenos blood thick enough to gum the servo joints at his knees. I work them free with the edge of my cleaning blade, my twisted hands making the task harder than it should be, harder than it would be for normal hands, for human hands, for hands that had not been warped by organs that grew wrong and hormones that flooded my system in patterns the apothecaries could not control. The metal comes free with a soft click that seems too loud in the silence of the armory, and I set the fragments aside in the collection tray, where they will be blessed and melted down and reforged into new ammunition, because nothing is wasted in the service of the Emperor, not even the shrapnel that bounces off the armor of his angels. I am Dren, and I clean the war gear of beings who achieved what I could not, who became what I was meant to be, who stand 8 feet tall in power armor that I will never wear except to maintain it, to polish it, to remove the gore and carbon scoring and blessed promethium residue that marks their service to the chapter. My hands shake as I work, not from fatigue, though I am tired, always tired, but from the way my bones grew when the osmodular implant went wrong, creating spurs and angles that press against nerves and tendons in ways that send small shocks of pain through my fingers with every movement. The pain is constant, has been constant for the 3 years since they pulled me from the sarcophagus and explained that I had failed, that my body had rejected the gene seed, that I would never be a blood angel, but I could serve them, and service is its own form of honor, though the honor tastes like ash when I swallow it. The scent of weapon oil reminds me of my father's makeshift rad suit, the way it smelled of ancient Greece and desperation, the way he would check the seals before every water run across the burning sands of Baal Secundus, making sure the suit would protect him from the radiation that killed slowly, that turned flesh cancerous and bones brittle, that marked every child born on that hell world with mutations that ranged from extra fingers to organs that grew outside the body. My father died when I was 7 years old, killed by cannibal raiders who wanted our tribe's water cache, who cut him open with rust-pitted blades and left him to bleed out in the red dust while my mother held my face against her chest so I would not see, so I would not watch the life leave his eyes, though I heard his screams, heard them cut off mid-sound in a way that told me exactly when he stopped being alive and started being meat. That was the way of Baal Secundus, where life was measured not in years but in survival intervals, in the spaces between attacks and droughts and radiation storms, where every breath of air tasted like metal and every sip of water might be your last. My tribe was called the Broken Blade, named for the ancient power sword fragment we carried as a sacred relic, believing it had been touched by Sanguinius himself during the Great Crusade. Though looking back, I understand it was probably just debris from some long-forgotten battle, given meaning only by our desperate need to believe that the angel cared about us, that our suffering mattered to something greater than the simple mechanics of survival on a dead world orbiting a dying sun. My mother bore the stigmata of radiation sickness the way most women on Baal Secundus did, with lesions that wept clear fluid and tumors that grew beneath her skin like small stones, with hair that fell out in clumps and teeth that loosened in her jaw, until she could only eat the softest gruel, the kind we made from ground insects and the few hardy plants that grew in the deep canyons where the radiation was less intense. She was 28 years old when my father died, and she looked 50, looked ancient, looked like death walking, but she was strong in the way that matters on a hell world. Strong enough to teach me how to survive, how to scavenge in the ruins of the ancients, how to fight off the fire scorpions that hunted in packs and could kill a grown man with a single sting from their neurotoxic tails. I showed fewer mutations than most children, which was considered lucky, considered blessed, as if the Emperor himself had marked me for something greater than dying young in the wasteland, though luck is just another word for random chance, for the genetic lottery that determines which radiation-damaged sperm fertilizes, which radiation-damaged egg. creating children who live, or children who die screaming in their first hours as their organs fail to form correctly. I had all my fingers and toes. Both my eyes worked properly. My spine was straight, my heart beat in its proper rhythm, and for these small mercies, my mother thanked the Emperor every night before we slept in our tribe's shelter, a cave reinforced with scrap metal and blessed with prayers that did nothing to keep out the radiation, but made us feel safer, made us feel like we were more than animals waiting to die. The sky darkened with the thunder of thunderhawks on my 13th birthday, which was not really my birthday, but the day my mother had decided to mark as the anniversary of my birth. Since exact dates meant nothing on a world where time was measured by the passage of caravans and the change of radiation patterns. The aircraft came down from the stars, like angels themselves, their engines screaming, their weapons arrays gleaming in the weak sunlight that filtered through Baal Secundus's toxic atmosphere, and every member of every tribe within 3 days' travel began to move toward Angel's Fall, toward the place of challenge where the Blood Angels would select new aspirants, new boys who would be given the chance to become more than human, to become transhuman, to become the chosen warriors of Sanguinius. My mother wept blood tears when she painted my face with the tribal markings, the radiation having damaged the small vessels behind her eyes, so that her tears were always tinged red, always looked like she was crying blood, which seemed appropriate given what I was about to attempt. Her hands shook as she drew the symbols on my cheeks and forehead, symbols that marked me as broken blade, as worthy of consideration, as someone who had survived long enough to be tested, and her lips moved in prayer, asking the Emperor to give me strength, asking Sanguinius to guide my steps, asking that I would become one of his angels, that I would rise above the wasteland and serve in glory, that my life would matter in ways that hers never had, never could. "You will become more than human, my son," she said, her voice breaking, her words coming through lips that were cracked and bleeding. "You will become a god's own weapon. You will fly among the stars. You will bring the Emperor's justice to his enemies, and when you fight, when you kill, you will do it with our blood in your veins, with our strength in your bones, with our prayers carrying you forward." I believed her, believed it with the absolute faith of someone who has never known anything but suffering, who has been raised on stories of angels who fell from the heavens and saved the desperate, who carried the blood of Sanguinius in their bodies and could not die, could not be stopped, could not fail. I believed that I would be chosen, that I would be transformed, that I would escape the hell world that had killed my father and was slowly killing my mother, that I would become beautiful and terrible and eternal. I was 13 years old, and I understood nothing about the cost of transformation, about what it meant to have your body torn apart and rebuilt, about the price paid by those who fail, about the horror of being caught between human and transhuman with no way forward and no way back. The trek to Angel's Fall took 6 days across terrain that killed dozens of aspirants before they ever reached the place of challenge, across wastes where the radiation was strong enough to make your teeth ache and your vision blur, where fire scorpions hunted in the rocks and mutant raiders attacked in the darkness, where boys from different tribes fought each other for scraps of food and drops of water, already beginning the competition that would determine who lived and who died. I traveled with 2 others from nearby tribes, boys I had seen at the great gatherings where tribes would meet to trade and share news. Boys who became something like friends during those 6 days. Though friendship is a strange thing to claim when you know that only a handful of the hundreds marching toward Angel's Fall will survive. Garvan was strong, built like the warriors of old, with muscles that seemed too large for his frame and a mind that worked slowly but thoroughly, processing each problem with careful deliberation before acting. He had killed 3 men by the time he was 12, killed them in defense of his tribe's water, killed them with his bare hands when the ammunition for his tribe's single-working autogun ran out, and he wore their teeth on a cord around his neck as proof of his worth. He shared his water with me on the second day when my canteen ran dry, and I shared my dried insect rations with him on the fourth day when his food ran out. And we both knew that when we reached Angel's Fall, when the trials began, we might have to kill each other, but until then we could be brothers, could help each other survive the wasteland that wanted us dead. Mikael was clever, small and quick, and always thinking 3 steps ahead, always planning, always looking for the angle that would keep him alive, the strategy that would give him an advantage. He could read the land the way my mother could read the radiation patterns, knowing where water might be found, where shelter could be made, where danger would come from, and he kept us alive through the worst of the journey, through the radiation storm on the 5th day that killed 30 aspirants who could not find shelter in time, through the fire scorpion pack that attacked on the night of the 3rd day and dragged 2 boys screaming into the darkness. His hands were too small to be a warrior's hands, his frame too light to wear power armor properly, but his mind was sharp as any blade, and I thought that if cleverness was what the Blood Angels valued, he would surely be chosen. We arrived at Angel's Fall on the morning of the 7th day, exhausted, dehydrated, half dead from radiation exposure and lack of sleep, but alive, which was more than could be said for the hundreds who had started the journey but would never complete it. The place of challenge was a massive structure carved into the side of a canyon, ancient beyond understanding, marked with symbols that hurt to look at too long, blessed by Sanguinius himself during the Great Crusade when he walked among his people and chose the best of them to serve at his side. The entrance was guarded by servitors, half-human machines with weapons grafted where their arms had been, with optical sensors replacing their eyes, with Vox units where their mouths should be, and they scanned each aspirant as we passed, recording our genetic profiles, checking us against some standard known only to the Blood Angels, deciding in that moment whether we were worth testing or should be turned away to die in the wasteland. I passed the scan, felt relief flood through me like cold water, like the first breath after drowning, because passing the scan meant I had a chance, meant my genetics were close enough to pure human stock that the gene seed might take, might integrate, might transform me into something greater. Garvan passed as well, his massive frame and obvious strength making him an ideal candidate, but Mikael was turned away, his genetic profile showing markers that the servitors considered too divergent, too mutated, too far from the baseline that the transformation required. He screamed as the servitors forced him back toward the wasteland, screamed that he had come so far that he deserved a chance, that his cleverness should count for something. But the servitors did not care about cleverness or determination or the 6 days of horror he had endured to reach this place. They cared only about genetic compatibility, about the cold mathematics of transformation success rates, about the fact that his body would reject the gene seed and waste resources that could be used on aspirants with better odds. I watched him disappear into the wasteland, watched him vanish beyond the rocks at the canyon entrance, and I felt something break inside me. Some innocence about the fairness of the selection process, some belief that worth was measured in character rather than genetics. Mikael had kept us alive, had used his intelligence to overcome obstacles that strength could not defeat, had proven himself more valuable than half the aspirants who passed the scan, but his value meant nothing because his chromosomes were wrong, because the radiation had damaged his DNA in ways that made him incompatible with the gene seed. He would die in the wasteland, probably within days, probably screaming for water or torn apart by fire scorpions, and no one would remember his name, no one would mark his passing because he had failed the first test through no fault of his own, through simple genetic bad luck. The trials began immediately, hundreds of aspirants competing for perhaps 50 slots, competing through physical challenges designed to test strength and endurance and pain tolerance, through combat trials where we fought each other with crude weapons while Blood Angels watched from above in their crimson armor, beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman, so far beyond us that looking at them hurt, that seeing what we might become was almost worse than knowing we might fail. We ran through canyons in the darkness, climbed cliffs without ropes or safety gear, jumped across chasms with crude hang gliders made from scrap metal and animal hide. And with every test, more aspirants died, falling into darkness or crushed by rock slides or simply collapsing from exhaustion and dehydration, their bodies giving out under the strain of challenges designed to push us beyond human limits. Garvin died on the third day of trials, stung by a fire scorpion during a canyon run where we had to navigate through their hunting grounds without weapons or protection. I was 10 meters ahead when I heard him scream, heard the sound cut off too quickly, heard the wet gurgling that meant the neurotoxin was already working, paralyzing his respiratory system, suffocating him while his heart still beat. I turned back, saw him convulsing on the ground, saw the scorpion scuttling away with its stinger still dripping venom, saw his eyes lock onto mine with an expression I still see in my dreams, an expression of betrayal, of accusation, as if I had failed him by not dying instead. I stood there for perhaps 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like hours, knowing that if I went back to help him, I would miss the checkpoint time and be eliminated, knowing that if I kept running, I would live and he would die. And I chose to live, chose to keep running, chose to abandon my friend to death by suffocation in a canyon full of monsters. The guilt from that choice follows me still, 3 years later, sits in my chest like a stone, grows heavier every time I remember his face, his eyes, the way his hand reached toward me even as his lungs stopped working. I tell myself that going back would not have saved him, that the neurotoxin works too fast for any treatment, that I would have died as well and accomplished nothing, but the rationalizations do not ease the guilt, do not change the fact that I chose my own survival over his life, that I made the calculation the blood angels wanted us to make, that I proved I would do whatever was necessary to succeed. They test us not just for physical capability, I understand now, but for the willingness to make inhuman choices, to value mission success over human connection, to become the kind of being who can watch their brothers die without hesitation, who can sacrifice anything and anyone in service to the chapter and the Emperor. I reached the checkpoint with 40 seconds to spare, joined the other aspirants who had survived the canyon run, and we looked at each other with eyes that were already starting to change, already starting to become harder, colder, more like the eyes of the blood angels who watched us from their observation platforms. We had lost friends, lost tribe mates, lost people we had traveled with and fought beside, and we felt nothing, could feel nothing, because feeling would be weakness, would be human, would mark us as unsuitable for transformation. We were being sorted, being filtered, being tested not just for physical capability, but for psychological suitability, for the capacity to become something more than human, which required first becoming something less, something emptier, something capable of functioning without the emotional connections that define humanity. The gladiatorial trials came on the 5th day, combat in an arena with weapons that were barely more than scrap metal, fighting other aspirants while the blood angels watched, evaluating our technique, our aggression, our will to survive. I killed 3 boys in that arena, boys whose names I never learned, whose faces I cannot forget, and with each kill something inside me died as well, some part of my humanity burned away in the necessity of survival. In the understanding that this was what the blood angels wanted from us, proof that we would kill without hesitation, that we would do what was necessary, no matter the cost to our souls. The first boy I killed was small, faster than me but weaker, and I caught him with a lucky blow that crushed his throat, watched him drown in his own blood while I stood over him with my improvised spear, watched his eyes go dim while hundreds of aspirants and dozens of blood angels observed without intervention, without mercy, without any sign that a human life had ended. The second boy was larger, stronger, more experienced in combat, and we fought for what felt like hours but was probably less than 10 minutes, trading blows that broke bones and opened wounds, until I managed to get inside his guard and drive my blade through his ribs, felt it scrape against bone and then slide between them, felt the moment when it pierced his heart and his entire body went rigid, felt his blood pour hot over my hands as he died with his eyes locked on mine, with his mouth trying to form words that would never come. The third boy I killed quickly, efficiently, without hesitation or ceremony, because by then I understood that this was simply what we did, what we had to do, that hesitation was weakness and mercy was death. That to become a blood angel meant first becoming a killer, becoming someone capable of taking life without reflection or regret. Of the 600 who started the trials, only 50 remained by the 7th day, 50 aspirants who had proven themselves worthy of consideration, who had survived challenges designed to kill the weak and reveal the strong, who stood before the blood angels in the great hall of Angels' Fall, with bodies covered in wounds and minds already beginning to change, already beginning to lose their humanity in preparation for what came next. We smelled recycled air for the first time in our lives. Air that did not taste of radiation or dust. Air that was clean in a way we had never experienced, and the cleanness of it made me nauseous, made my lungs ache because my body had adapted to breathing poison and now struggled to process something pure. The servitors moved among us, mechanical and precise, measuring our dimensions, taking blood samples, scanning our genetic profiles with equipment that hummed with power and purpose, and I watched them with a mixture of curiosity and unease, wondering if they had once been human like us, wondering if they remembered what it felt like to have dreams and hopes and fears, or if those things had been burned away during their conversion, leaving only the mechanical efficiency that defined their existence. A servo skull floated past my face, its empty eye sockets fitted with red optical sensors that scanned my retinas, and I felt a chill run through me, felt the first real understanding that becoming a blood angel might require losing parts of myself that could never be recovered, that transformation was not just physical, but psychological, that the angels I had worshipped from the wasteland might be something other than human in ways I had never considered. The 72-hour vigil began without ceremony or explanation. 50 aspirants forced to remain standing in the great hall without rest, without sleep, without any allowance for the exhaustion that already made our legs shake and our vision blur. Blood servitors patrolled the edges of the hall, massive cybernetic constructs with weapons grafted to their arms and tracking systems that never blinked, never looked away, never missed the moment when an aspirant's legs gave out or their eyes closed for more than a second. I watched them take boys away, boys who simply could not maintain consciousness any longer, boys who collapsed despite their determination, despite their prayers, despite their desperate need to succeed, and I wondered what happened to them, whether they died, or were converted into servitors themselves, whether failure here meant death or something worse than death, something that would leave them alive but emptied, functioning but not truly living. By the second day I was hallucinating, seeing my mother standing in the corner of the hall with her blood tears streaming down her face, seeing Garvan and Mikael and the 3 boys I had killed in the arena, all of them staring at me with expressions I could not read, could not understand, expressions that might have been accusation or forgiveness, or simply the blank regard of the dead looking at the living. I bit through my own tongue to stay awake, used pain as an anchor to consciousness, tasted copper and salt as blood filled my mouth, swallowed it rather than spit because showing weakness would be failure, because every action was evaluated, because we were being tested not just for physical endurance, but for mental resilience, for the capacity to function past the point where human limitations should force us to stop. By the third day, I was no longer certain what was real and what was hallucination, no longer confident that the blood angels watching us were actually present, or were just visions my exhausted brain had created to make sense of the blurred figures in crimson armor that seemed to float at the edges of my perception. 24 aspirants had been taken away by then, 24 failures who would never become blood angels, and the 34 of us who remained stood with legs that barely supported our weight, with minds that functioned on instinct more than conscious thought, with bodies that had been pushed beyond their design specifications and were starting to fail in small but important ways. My heart beat irregularly, skipping beats and then racing to catch up, and I wondered if I was dying, if I would fail, not because I chose to sleep, but because my body simply gave out under the strain, because I had inherited my mother's radiation-damaged heart, and it could not take the stress of the vigil. The sanguinary priests arrived in the last hour of the third day, figures in golden armor that seemed to glow with their own light, carrying between them a chalice that radiated power I could feel in my bones, in my blood, in the deepest parts of my genetic code that recognized what the chalice contained, even though my conscious mind could not name it. The high priest intoned words in a language I did not understand, but felt in my soul, words that spoke of transformation and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth, of the angel who had died protecting the emperor and whose genetic legacy would live on in those found worthy to carry it. He moved among us, the chalice held before him like a religious artifact, like the most holy relic, because that is what it was, the cup that held the processed gene seed material, the blood of Sanguinius, diluted and modified, but still containing the essence of divinity, still carrying the potential to transform human flesh into transhuman perfection. "You drink the blood of the angel," the high priest said, his voice amplified by the Vox systems in his helmet, echoing through the great hall like the voice of the emperor himself. "You will be reborn as his sons, as the chosen warriors of the 9th Legion, as the defenders of humanity and the destroyers of the emperor's enemies. Or you will be consumed by what you cannot contain, and your failure will serve as warning to those who follow. There is no shame in death during transformation, only shame in refusing to attempt it, only shame in choosing comfortable mediocrity over glorious sacrifice." The chalice came to me, held by hands encased in golden ceramite, and I looked into its depths and saw liquid that was red like blood but moved wrong. Moved with a viscosity that suggested it was more than liquid, more than simple biological fluid, something alive in ways that made my genetic code scream in recognition and terror. I hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, 2 seconds in which I understood that drinking from this chalice would change me irrevocably, would either transform me into something glorious or kill me in ways that would make the deaths in the arena look merciful. And then I drank, because I had come too far to stop now, because turning back would mean admitting that Garvin and Mikael and all the others who had died to get us here had died for nothing. The liquid burned going down, burned not with heat, but with cold, with a chill that spread from my throat into my chest and then outward through my entire body, following my circulatory system like ice water in my veins. I tasted copper and something else. Something I had no words for, something ancient and terrible and divine, the genetic essence of a being who had been more than human even before the Emperor made him into a Primarch, whose DNA carried codes and instructions that would rewrite my body at the cellular level, that would trigger changes the human genome was never designed to support. My vision blurred, my hearing faded to white noise, my sense of balance vanished, and I felt myself falling through darkness that seemed to have no bottom, and my last conscious thought before the darkness took me completely was simple and desperate and doomed to remain unanswered. I will be an angel. I will serve the Emperor. I woke into darkness, into a darkness so complete that for a moment I thought I had died, thought the transformation had failed immediately. And this was what death felt like. This absolute absence of sensation, this void where nothing existed except my thoughts. But then I became aware of sounds, faint mechanical sounds, the hum of life support systems, the whisper of recycling air processors, the distant rhythm of something that might have been prayers or might have been machine code. And I understood that I was not dead but entombed, sealed in some kind of life support casket where the transformation would take place. where my body would be rebuilt or would fail in the attempt. I could not move, could not open my eyes, could not make any sound through the tubes that filled my throat and connected directly to my lungs, forcing air in and out in a rhythm that felt wrong, felt too slow or too fast, felt like someone else was breathing for me while I remained a passenger in my own body. I felt tubes in my arms as well, needles sunk deep into my veins, pumping fluids that burned cold, that made my muscles spasm and my bones ache, that carried the genetic material and hormones and growth factors that would trigger the changes the gene seed required. I could feel my heart beating, could feel it stuttering and racing and struggling to maintain rhythm, could feel something else growing next to it, a second heart forming from stem cells and genetic instructions, pushing against my other organs, making room for itself, whether my body had room to give or not. Time stopped having meaning, stopped being something I could measure or track or understand. There were only periods of consciousness and periods of unconsciousness, periods where I was aware of the changes happening to my body and periods where I was grateful to be unaware, where the darkness took me and I felt nothing, thought nothing, existed in a state of blessed emptiness where I did not have to confront what was being done to me. The audio implants in the casket whispered constantly, feeding me information I could not process, litanies in high Gothic that my brain absorbed without understanding, tactical data and combat protocols, and the history of the Blood Angels from their founding to the present. 10,000 years of service to the Emperor, compressed into data streams that flowed into my mind like water filling a vessel, though I was not sure there was room for all this information. Not sure my brain could hold it without breaking. The transformation happened in stages, each organ implanted and given time to integrate, each change monitored by the apothecaries who worked in the hall of sarcophagi, who moved among hundreds of caskets where aspirants underwent the same process, where some succeeded and became blood angels, while others failed and died, or were converted into servitors, or, if they were very unlucky, survived in states somewhere between human and transhuman, trapped in bodies that had changed but not enough, that carried the curse of the gene seed without its blessings. My secondary heart began beating in the 4th week, began pumping blood in a rhythm that did not match my primary heart, creating a sensation of dislocation, of having 2 different timings running in my chest, fighting for dominance, struggling to synchronize but never quite achieving it. The osmodular implant came next, a small organ that would secrete hormones to strengthen my bones, to make them more dense, to allow them to drink in ceramic compounds and become harder than human bones could ever be, strong enough to support the massive muscles that would grow, strong enough to withstand impacts that would shatter normal skeletal structure. I felt my bones crack and reform, felt them growing thicker and longer, felt my body stretching in ways that made every movement agony, that made me grateful for the paralytic agents that kept me from moving, from trying to escape the casket, from tearing at the tubes and needles in a desperate attempt to make the pain stop. The biscopeia came in the 3rd month, an organ that would enhance muscle growth, that would take the exercise I would eventually do and amplify its effects 100-fold, that would allow me to grow muscles that could crush steel and tear through armor with my bare hands. I felt my muscles twitching and growing, felt them pressing against my skin from the inside, felt my body mass increasing day by day, week by week, becoming something larger than human, something more. But the growth was not even, not symmetrical, not the perfect enhancement the biscopeia was supposed to provide. Some muscles grew more than others, creating imbalances that the apothecaries tried to correct with additional hormones, with targeted inhibitors, with desperate attempts to force my body to follow the pattern the gene seed demanded. By the 5th month, I was experiencing sensations I had no words for, sensations that came from organs I had never possessed before, from new glands and enhanced organs, and modified systems that were supposed to make me transhuman but felt more like they were making me alien, more like they were turning me into something that was neither human nor Astartes, but some third thing that should not exist. My sense of taste changed, became more sensitive and more specific. Could detect compounds I had never known were in my food. Could taste the molecular structure of the nutrient gruel they fed me through my tubes. My sense of smell enhanced until I could identify individuals by their scent alone, could tell what they had eaten and when they had slept and whether they were afraid or angry or calm. Information I had no use for, but could not stop processing. The hypno-conditioning played constantly, wearing grooves in my mind, writing over my memories with new information, new loyalties, new purposes. "You are a weapon of the Emperor," the litany said, repeated so often that the words lost meaning and became simple sounds, simple patterns of vibration that my brain processed without conscious thought. "You are his wrath made manifest. You are the defenders of humanity. You are the chosen of Sanguinius. You are death to the enemies of the Imperium. You serve without question. You fight without fear. You die without regret." The memories of Sanguinius began bleeding into my consciousness in the 6th month. Genetic memories encoded in the gene seed, passed down from the Primarch himself to every blood angel who carried his genetic legacy. I saw visions of Baal as it had been 10,000 years ago, saw Sanguinius walking among his people before the Emperor found him, saw him learning to fly with wings that grew from his back like some kind of angel from ancient Terran mythology. I felt his joy in flight, his sorrow at being different from his people, his determination to protect them even though they feared him, and for brief moments I was not Dren but Sanguinius, was not an aspirant but a Primarch, was experiencing memories that were older than my entire civilization. But the memories were wrong, corrupted, twisted by something I could not identify or understand. Sanguinius's death played over and over in my mind, his final battle with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, his sacrifice to wound the arch-traitor before the Emperor arrived, his last moments as the life left his body and his soul departed into whatever comes after death for beings like the Primarchs. The memory should have been glorious, should have shown his courage and nobility, should have inspired me to serve with the same dedication he had shown. Instead, it was horror, was madness, was Sanguinius screaming my name as he died, was his eyes finding mine across 10,000 years of time and asking why I had not saved him, why I had let him die, why I was not there when he needed me. I tried to scream, but the tubes prevented it. Tried to explain that I had not even been born when he died, that I could not have helped him, that his death was history, and I was nothing but a failed aspirant who had drunk his blood and was paying for that presumption. The visions grew worse, grew more frequent, became my primary reality while my physical body became a distant thing. A meat prison that held me while my mind lived in the past, experienced the death of the angel again and again, felt his agony as Horus crushed his throat and broke his wings and ended his life with contempt and hatred and satisfaction at destroying something so perfect. Around month 7, something went fundamentally wrong, went wrong in ways that the apothecaries could not fix, could not compensate for, could not overcome with additional hormones or inhibitors or desperate interventions. I heard the alarm klaxons through my audio pickups, heard them blaring in the Hall of Sarcophagi, heard the apothecaries shouting to each other in medical terminology I could barely understand, but knew meant catastrophe. Knew meant failure. Knew meant that my body was rejecting the gene seed in ways that would kill me if they did not act immediately. Subject 27 experiencing acute immunodeficiency collapse, one apothecary said, his voice clinically detached even as he described my impending death. Gene seed organs failing to integrate. Rejection response is catastrophic. His immune system is attacking the implants faster than we can suppress the response. His secondary heart is arrhythmic, another voice said. Female, belonging to one of the few women who served as apothecaries in the chapter. Pattern suggests it will fail within 72 hours, and when it fails, it will flood his system with necrotic tissue that his primary heart cannot process. The os modula is secreting hormones erratically, a third voice added. Mechanical, possibly belonging to a servitor programmed to monitor my vital signs. Bone growth is accelerating in random patterns, creating internal spurs that are piercing surrounding muscle tissue and major blood vessels. Recommend immediate surgical intervention. The Biscopea is producing tumorous growths instead of enhanced muscle fibers, the first apothecary said, and I heard something in his voice that might have been frustration or disappointment or simple clinical interest in an unexpected outcome. His muscle mass is increasing, but the tissue is non-functional, possibly precancerous, definitely compromising his ability to move even if we can resolve the other issues. What about the black carapace? Someone asked, and I felt cold terror flood through me at the mention of that organ. The final implant, the one that would allow me to interface with power armor, that would make me truly Astartes. Beginning to grow but showing immediate rejection signs, the female apothecary said. His skin is rejecting it, trying to push it out, creating necrotic patches across his torso that are weeping pus and showing signs of secondary infection. If we proceed with full black carapace integration, it will kill him, and if we remove what's already grown, it will leave him with permanent scarring and loss of sensation across 40% of his body. The sanguinary priests arrived, their voices carrying the authority of those who spoke for the chapter itself, who made decisions about life and death with the same clinical precision they used to manage the gene seed stocks to determine which aspirants would live and which would die. Has the gene seed been compromised? The high priest asked, and I heard in his voice not concern for me, but for the precious genetic material that had been implanted in my body. Material that had come from Sanguinius himself, that was irreplaceable and infinitely valuable. The progenoid glands have not yet matured, one of the apothecaries responded. We can extract 6 of the implanted organs before total loss, can salvage the gene seed material for use in future aspirants, but the subject himself is beyond recovery, beyond transformation into full Astartes status. Psychological status? The high priest asked, and I felt a surge of something that might have been hope, might have been the desperate belief that even if my body had failed, my mind might be intact, might be worth preserving. Showing signs of proto-black rage, the female apothecary said, and the hope died before it had fully formed. The genetic memories of Sanguinius's death are manifesting during transformation, which is extremely unusual. Typically, the black rage only appears in fully transformed Astartes who have served for decades or centuries. His mind is experiencing the death visions while his body undergoes the physical changes, creating a feedback loop that is accelerating both the psychological and physical breakdown. Additionally, red thirst manifestation is advanced, another voice added. Subject is exhibiting signs of blood obsession even while comatose. His brain activity shows patterns consistent with feeding fantasies, with the desperate hunger for blood that defines the curse our chapter carries. This is occurring months before it should, if it should occur at all in a failed aspirant. The discussion continued above me, around me, about me, but never including me, the apothecaries and sanguinary priests debating my fate with the same tone they might use to discuss a piece of equipment, a failed component, a system that had not performed to specifications. I was not a person to them, not Dren, who had survived the trials and drunk from the Red Grail and endured 7 months of agony in pursuit of transformation. I was Subject 27, a genetic experiment that had failed, a waste of resources and gene seed, something to be disposed of or salvaged depending on which option provided more value to the chapter. Options, the high priest said, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade. Give me the options for Subject 27. Euthanasia, the first apothecary said immediately. End his suffering quickly. Extract what gene seed organs can be salvaged. recycle his biomass according to standard protocols. This would be the mercy, would spare him years of pain and dysfunction, would allow him to die before he experiences the full horror of his failed transformation. Servitor conversion, another suggested. His brain is still functional despite the psychological anomalies. His body is damaged but operational. We could convert him into a labor servitor for the fortress monastery. Let him serve in that capacity for whatever years his compromised system can sustain life. Chapter serve, the female apothecary said quietly, almost reluctantly. Rare honor for one who has endured so much would allow him to serve the chapter in support capacity, to maintain war gear and defend the fortress when needed, to live in the shadow of the Blood Angels and find purpose in that service. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to believe they had chosen euthanasia, that they would open my casket and end my life before I woke, that I would die having never seen the result of my failed transformation, never known what I had become. But then Brother Chaplain Serath spoke, his voice carrying the authority of one who served as the spiritual guide to the chapter, who understood not just the mechanical requirements of transformation, but the psychological needs of those who attempted it. Subject 27 has earned the right to choose, Serath said slowly, carefully, each word chosen with precision. He survived the trials on Baal Secundus. He endured the vigil. He drank from the Red Grail, knowing the cost. He has suffered 7 months of transformation that would have killed most humans in the first week. He has proven his dedication, his faith, his willingness to sacrifice everything in service to the chapter and the Emperor. We will wake him, we will explain his situation, and we will allow him to decide whether he wishes euthanasia or service as a chapter serf. That is irregular, someone objected, but Serath cut them off before they could continue. Irregular, but not unprecedented, he said firmly. The Blood Angels were founded on the principle that honor comes in many forms, that service to the Emperor can be given by all who possess the will to serve, that we do not discard those who attempt greatness merely because they fail to achieve it. Subject 27 will be given the choice, and we will honor whatever decision he makes. I woke for the first time in 7 months, woke to agony more complete than anything I had experienced during the trials, woke to a body that felt wrong in every way, that moved wrong, that responded to my commands slowly and poorly, that hurt with a pain that had no location because it was everywhere, was every nerve firing at once, was every muscle cramping and every bone aching and every organ struggling to function in a system that had been damaged beyond its capacity to heal. I tore free from the nutrient tubes, pulled them from my throat and arms and groin with movements that sent fresh waves of pain through my nervous system, vomited blood and amniotic fluid across the floor of the medical bay. Tried to stand and fell immediately because my legs would not support my weight properly, because the bones had grown wrong and the muscles were imbalanced and my sense of equilibrium was destroyed. I caught my reflection in a polished metal surface, saw what I had become, saw the monster the transformation had made me. My face was still recognizably human, still recognizably mine, but swollen and distorted, with eyes that were too large for my skull, with a jaw that had grown heavier and more pronounced, with teeth that had changed to something between human and Astartes, too large for my mouth, pressing against my lips, making it difficult to close my jaw properly. My torso was a horror of failed black carapace, patches of hardened tissue that looked like dark brown leather, cracked and weeping clear fluid, covering perhaps 40% of my chest and back in irregular patterns that would never heal, that would crack further every time I moved, that would mark me as a failed aspirant for the rest of my life. My arms were too long for my body, muscled but asymmetric, the left arm noticeably larger than the right, both ending in hands that were supposed to be able to crush steel, but instead were twisted, the fingers not quite closing properly, the bones having grown in patterns that pressed against tendons and nerves in ways that sent constant signals of pain to my brain. My legs were worse, strong enough to support weight that would break human bones, but malformed, one slightly shorter than the other, creating a limp that would never heal, that would mark every step I took for the rest of my life. I tried to scream, but my voice came out wrong, came out as something between human speech and the deeper register of an Astartes, a sound that belonged to neither one nor the other, that was discordant and disturbing even to my own ears. Blood servitors moved to restrain me, their mechanical precision making resistance futile, their augmented strength far greater than my compromised body could produce, and they held me immobile while the apothecaries and sanguinary priests and Brother Chaplain Serath entered the medical bay to deliver their judgment. "Subject 27, the high priest said, and something in his tone made it clear he was using my designation rather than any name, because names were for people, and I was not quite a person anymore, was something between categories, something that did not fit in the neat organizational structures the Blood Angels used to classify their members. You have failed the trials of ascension. Your body has rejected the gene seed in ways that cannot be corrected, cannot be overcome, cannot be compensated for through additional intervention. 6 organs have been successfully extracted and will be used in future aspirants. The gene seed material has been preserved and remains viable, so your suffering has not been entirely without value to the chapter." I wanted to laugh at that last part, wanted to express the bitter humor in being told that my 7 months of agony had been valuable because they had salvaged some organs before I failed completely. But my vocal cords could not produce laughter, could only produce sounds that might have been crying, or might have been something else entirely. "You have 3 options," Brother Chaplain Serath said, stepping forward, his armor so black it seemed to drink in light, his skull helm making him look like death itself, like the end that waited for all of us eventually. "First, euthanasia, administered quickly and painlessly, allowing you to die with honor before your failed transformation becomes more agonizing. Second, servitor conversion. Your mind would be wiped and your body used for labor or combat as needed. You would serve the chapter, but without consciousness or suffering. Third, you may choose to serve as a chapter serf, to maintain our war gear and defend our fortress, to live in service to the Blood Angels with full awareness of what you have become and what you have lost. The choice should have been easy, should have been obvious. Euthanasia would end the pain, would spare me from living in a body that hurt constantly. That would never be what I was meant to become. That would remind me with every breath of my failure. Servitor conversion would be merciful in its own way, would take away my consciousness and with it the suffering, the grief, the bitter knowledge that I had come so close to transformation only to fall short at the last moment. But even as I considered these options, even as I acknowledged their appeal, their mercy, their logic, I found myself speaking words I had not consciously decided to say. "I can still serve," I said through blood-frothed lips, through a mouth that barely worked, through vocal cords that produced sounds no human or Astartes should make. "The chapter, the Emperor, I can still serve. I can maintain your armor. I can defend your fortress. I can do what needs to be done, even if I can never be what I wanted to be." Brother Chaplain Serath studied me for a long moment, his skull helm revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind it, and then he nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry weight beyond its simple motion. "Very well. Subject 27 is redesignated as Chapter Serf Dren. He will serve in the armory under Master of the Forge Therion. He will be trained in the maintenance of sacred war gear. He will be given quarters appropriate to his station, and when we march to war, he will defend our fortress with whatever strength his compromised body can provide. He has earned the right to serve in the shadow of what he could not become." I wept then, wept tears that were half blood because my tear ducts had been damaged during the transformation, wept with relief and grief and bitter shame, wept for what I had lost and what I had barely gained, wept for Garvin and Mikael and my mother and my father and everyone who had died to get me to this moment, wept because I was still alive when so many others were dead, and I did not know if survival was a blessing or a curse. The months of recovery that followed were almost as agonizing as the transformation itself, though the agony was different, was physical therapy and surgery rather than genetic modification, was learning to use my malformed body rather than having it changed against my will. The apothecaries removed the most dangerous failed organs, the ones that would kill me if left in place, but others remained because removing them would be more dangerous than leaving them alone. My secondary heart stayed, arrhythmic and unreliable, beating to its own rhythm that never quite synchronized with my primary heart, creating a sensation of dislocation that never went away. The failed black carapace stayed as well, too integrated with my skin to be safely removed, marking me permanently as a failed aspirant, as someone who had drunk the blood of the angel and been found wanting. I learned to walk again with my asymmetric legs, learned to compensate for the limp, learned to distribute my weight in ways that would not strain the bones that had grown wrong. I learned to use my hands despite the way the fingers did not close properly, developed techniques for gripping and holding and manipulating objects that worked around the limitations of my twisted joints and malformed tendons. I learned to speak clearly despite my altered vocal cords, practiced forming words until I could make myself understood without sounding completely inhuman, though my voice would never sound quite right, would always carry that edge of wrongness that marked me as neither human nor Astartes. I caught my reflection often during those months, saw myself in polished metal and clear water and the empty eyes of servitors, and each time I was shocked by what I saw, shocked by the monster I had become. My face was still recognizably mine, but distorted, changed, marked by the failed transformation in ways that would never heal. My body was too large for human, but far too small for Astartes, trapped in a middle ground that made me conspicuous among both populations, made me obviously wrong to anyone who looked at me. The scars from the failed black carapace cracked when I moved, wept fluid when I strained, reminded me constantly that I carried the mark of the angel but not his blessing, that I had been touched by divinity and broken by it. I was 15 years old, and I knew I would never be whole again. Knew that the rest of my life would be lived in pain and limitation, knew that every day would be a reminder of what I had lost, of what I had tried to become and failed to achieve. But I was alive, was conscious, was capable of service, and in the Imperium those three things were enough to justify existence, were enough to give purpose to a life that had been broken in pursuit of transformation. The armory became my home, became my world, became the place where I spent every waking hour in service to the blood angels who had achieved what I could not. Master of the Forge. Therion assigned me to armor maintenance for the 5th Company, gave me responsibility for the sacred war gear worn by 50 blood angels, 50 warriors who went to war in ceramite plate that I cleaned and blessed and repaired, who trusted their lives to equipment I maintained. The training was extensive, was months of learning from older serfs who had served for decades, who knew every aspect of power armor maintenance, from the macro-scale repairs to the micro-adjustments that kept servo joints functioning smoothly. I learned how to polish ceramite without scratching it, learned the prayers that must be spoken while working with sacred war gear, learned how to identify damage patterns and predict failures before they occurred, learned how to clean bolters without damaging the blessed mechanisms, learned how to repair seals and replace power cells and calibrate targeting systems. The work was meditative, was repetitive in ways that allowed my mind to quiet, that gave me purpose without requiring me to think about what I had become, that let me serve in concrete ways that produced measurable results. The other serfs became my family, became the only people who understood what it meant to live in the shadow of the blood angels, to serve beings who had achieved transformation while we had failed or never attempted it. There was Theron, who had made it through 8 months of transformation before his vocal cords were destroyed by a failed larynx implant, leaving him unable to speak, communicating only through sign language and written notes. There was Senna, a woman whose family had served the Blood Angels for generations, who had chosen to become a serf rather than attempt transformation, who carried the institutional knowledge of the chapter in her mind and taught me more about the Blood Angels' history and traditions than any of the chaplains ever would. There was Cade, an old man who had survived more than 50 years as a serf despite having half his face destroyed in a training accident, who had seen thousands of aspirants attempt transformation and fail, who had watched the chapter evolve through decades of war and peace and internal struggle. He became something like a father to me, taught me the unwritten rules of serf life, the ways to avoid attention, the methods for managing pain without medication, the techniques for surviving in a place where we were invisible most of the time, but scrutinized intensely when we made mistakes. Every one of us has held that blade, Cade told me one night when he found me in my quarters with a razor in hand, found me contemplating the quick cut that would end the pain and the shame and the constant reminder of failure. Every failed aspirant has faced the same choice, to live with what we've become or to end it before the weight gets too heavy. But we serve, boy. We serve because service is all we have, all we can give, all that justifies our continued existence in a universe that has no use for the weak or the broken. I put the blade down, not because the despair went away, but because Cade was right, because service was all I had, because killing myself would be one final failure, one last betrayal of everyone who had died to get me to this point. I would live, would serve, would find whatever purpose existed for a failed aspirant in a chapter of angels, even if that purpose felt empty, even if the service felt meaningless, even if every day was a reminder that I carried the curse of the Blood Angels without their glory. The daily routine became my anchor, became the structure that kept me functional when the despair threatened to overwhelm me. I woke at 0400 hours in the cramped dormitory that serfs shared, comfortable by the standards of most Imperial citizens, but Spartan compared to the quarters where Blood Angels rested between campaigns. I performed my ablutions and said my prayers to the Emperor and Sanguinius, asking for strength to serve another day, asking for purpose in my service, asking that my failure would somehow contribute to the chapter's glory, even if I could never participate in that glory directly. From 0500 to 1200, I worked in the armory, maintaining the war gear of the 5th Company, cleaning blood and Xenos residue from ceramite plate, repairing damage, blessing every piece according to the proper rituals, ensuring that when the Blood Angels went to war, their equipment would not fail them. The work was physically demanding despite my compromised body, requiring strength I barely possessed, requiring precision my twisted hands struggled to provide. But I learned to compensate, learned to use my limitations creatively, learned to produce work that met the exacting standards the chapter required. At 1200, I ate my single meal of the day, protein paste and vegetables grown in the fortress monastery's hydroponics bays. Food that was nutritious but bland, that kept me alive and functional, but provided no pleasure, no comfort, no distraction from the constant awareness of what I had become. I ate with other serfs, listened to their conversations, learned their stories, found comfort in the shared understanding that we were all broken in different ways, all serving in the shadow of beings who had achieved transformation while we had not. From 1300 to 1800, I returned to my duties, continued the endless cycle of maintenance and repair, handled war gear that had been blessed by chaplains and worn by heroes, touched greatness every day while remaining further from it than the lowest mutant in the Underhive. From 1800 to 2000, I trained in combat, because all serfs must be able to defend the fortress monastery when the Blood Angels marched to war, must be able to hold weapons and fight enemies, even though we lacked the enhanced capabilities of true Astartes. I learned to fire a lasgun, learned basic tactics, learned how to die in ways that would serve the chapter, that would buy time for the Blood Angels to return and cleanse whatever had breached our defenses. From 2000 to 2100, I had personal time. Time I usually spent watching the Blood Angels train, watching them move through combat drills with speed and grace my body would never achieve, watching them demonstrate capabilities I tried to gain and failed to develop. It was masochistic, was self-punishment disguised as observation, but I could not stop watching, could not stop comparing what they were to what I was, could not stop calculating the distance between my broken form and their transhuman perfection. At 2100 I slept, or tried to sleep, though sleep was often difficult, was often filled with nightmares of the transformation, dreams of Sanguinius dying while calling my name, visions of my failed organs growing inside me like tumors, memories of the boys I'd killed in the arena and the friends who had died during the trials. I woke often, woke gasping and disoriented, woke to pain from the failed black carapace that cracked when I moved in my sleep, woke to the arrhythmic beating of my secondary heart that created a sensation of wrongness I could never escape. The relationship between serfs and blood angels was complex, was not quite master and servant, because that would imply a personal connection that did not exist, was more like the relationship between a person and the furniture in their room, acknowledged when useful, ignored when not, maintained when broken, replaced when beyond repair. Most blood angels never spoke to us, never acknowledged our presence except when they needed something, moved through the fortress monastery as if we were invisible, as if our service was so automatic, so natural, so expected that it required no recognition or gratitude. But occasionally one would speak to me, would acknowledge my existence with a few words that I would treasure for weeks afterward, would turn over in my mind during the long hours of maintenance work, analyzing every word for hidden meaning, for approval or disapproval, for some sign that my service mattered to beings who barely registered my existence. Brother Sergeant Aramis of the 5th Company sometimes spoke to me when I maintained his armor, his deep voice resonating through his helmet's Vox system even when he was not actively transmitting. "Your work is adequate, Serf," he said once, and the word adequate felt like the highest praise I had ever received, felt like validation that my broken hands and compromised body could still produce something of value, that my service was not entirely worthless. The Emperor is served by all who give their worth, from the mightiest Primarch to the lowest servant, all contribute to his grand design according to their capabilities. Brother Dante, a young blood angel who had only completed his transformation 3 years earlier, asked about my scars once, pointed at the failed black carapace that covered my torso in irregular patterns of hardened tissue. "You were an aspirant," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement, recognition of what the scars meant, of what they implied about my past and my failure. I explained briefly, described the trials and the transformation and the rejection that had left me broken between human and Astartes, described the choice I had made to serve rather than die, and something passed across his face that might have been pity, or might have been discomfort, or might have been guilt, the expression of someone who had succeeded looking at someone who had failed, confronting the reality that transformation was not guaranteed, that some who drank from the Red Grail were destroyed by what they could not contain. He left quickly after that, said nothing more, but the brief interaction haunted me for weeks, replayed in my mind during my personal hours, analyzed from every angle. The angel had looked at me, had seen my scars, had recognized what they meant, and his eyes had held something that might have been sympathy, might have been the understanding that I had tried for the same transformation he had achieved, that only genetic chance separated us, that he could have been me if his body had rejected the gene seed the way mine had. The serf community was tight-knit in ways the blood angels could never be, bound together by shared trauma and shared service, by the understanding that we were all broken and that our brokenness created a connection the angels could never feel. Not all serfs were failed aspirants like me. Some were born into families that had served the chapter for generations. Some were recruited from the Fortress Monastery's support staff. Some were survivors of worlds the Blood Angels had saved, who had chosen to follow the chapter rather than remain on planets that no longer felt like home. But the failed aspirants formed their own sub-community within the larger group, bound by the specific trauma of having attempted transformation and having our bodies reject what our minds desperately wanted to accept. We all carried visible marks of our failures, all had bodies that were wrong in different ways, all lived with constant pain and limitation and the bitter knowledge that we had tried to become angels and instead became monsters. Theron's failed larynx implant had enhanced his hearing to painful levels while destroying his ability to speak, leaving him hypersensitive to sound, wearing earplugs most of the time to reduce the input, communicating through sign language that most Blood Angels never bothered to learn. Brennus had ossa modula that went into overdrive, creating bone spurs that erupted from his back in jagged patterns, causing constant pain that he managed through meditation and pain rituals in the Reclusium, seeking penance for his failure through voluntary suffering. Loken had partially functioning oculobe implants that created permanent pupil dilation, leaving him seeing too much light, wearing dark lenses most of the time, working night shifts when possible to avoid the brightness that caused him migraines. Irina was a female serf whose brother had successfully transformed into a full Blood Angel, who had chosen to become a serf to remain near him, to serve the chapter he served, to stay connected to the only family she had left, even though he barely acknowledged her existence, even though his transformation had taken him so far from humanity that he no longer recognized emotional bonds, that he treated his own sister with the same distant courtesy he showed any other serf. We carried our failures differently, managed our pain through different strategies, found purpose in different aspects of our service, but we all understood each other in ways that outsiders never could, understood the weight of living in the shadow of the angels, of serving beings who had achieved what we could not, of existing in a state between human and transhuman that left us belonging to neither category. The psychological scars were harder to manage than the physical ones, were less visible but more debilitating, manifested in ways that disrupted our service and threatened our continued existence in the chapter. Survivors' guilt was common, was the constant question of why we had survived the trials when others had died, why we had been given the chance to drink from the Red Grail when boys like Garvin and Mikael had died before reaching that point, why our bodies had rejected transformation while others had succeeded, why we were alive and serving while thousands who had attempted the same path were dead or converted into servitors. Some serfs developed obsessive behaviors as coping mechanisms, found relief from psychological pain through repetitive actions that gave them control over something, anything, in lives where control was largely illusory. Theron would polish the same armor piece for hours, seeking perfection that could never be achieved, losing himself in the meditative repetition of cloth against ceramite, in the slow transformation of battle-scarred plate into gleaming perfection. Brennus volunteered for pain rituals in the Reclusium, sought penance through voluntary suffering, believed that if he could not serve as a Blood Angel, he could at least share their pain, could participate in the chapter's suffering even if he could not participate in their glory. I hoarded small artifacts touched by Blood Angels, a spent bolt casing from Brother Sergeant Aramis's bolter, a fragment of purity seal that had fallen from Brother Dante's armor, a piece of broken ceramic from the training grounds where Blood Angels practiced close combat. The artifacts meant nothing objectively, were trash that should have been discarded, but to me they were precious, were physical connections to the angels, were proof that I existed in their world even if I could never truly be part of it. The red thirst whispered to me constantly, never went away despite the fact that I was not a full Blood Angel, despite the fact that my transformation had failed before the final stages, despite the fact that I should not carry the curse that defined the chapter. The gene seed material I'd received contained fragments of Sanguinius's genetic code, carried instructions for both blessing and curse, And while my body had rejected the blessings, the curses had taken root, had found purchase in my damaged genetic structure, had manifested in ways that should have been impossible for a failed aspirant. When blood angels returned from battle, when they walked through the fortress monastery with their armor still covered in enemy blood, I felt something awaken inside me, felt a hunger that had nothing to do with food or water, felt a desperate craving for the blood that stained their ceramite. The scent of blood, whether human or Xenos, triggered responses in my brain that I could not control, that flooded my system with chemicals that made my hands shake and my mouth water, and my thoughts turn to feeding, to drinking, to satisfying the hunger that grew stronger every time I smelled fresh blood. I hid the red thirst carefully, knowing that showing such symptoms as a serf could mean execution or servitor conversion, knowing that the blood angels tolerated the curse in their battle brothers, because those brothers were valuable enough to justify the risk, but serfs were not valuable, were replaceable, were resources that could be disposed of if they became liabilities. I learned to control my breathing when blood angels passed by covered in gore, learned to focus my mind on maintenance procedures and prayer when the hunger threatened to overwhelm my self-control, learned to avoid the areas where wounded blood angels were treated because the scent of fresh blood in those places was strong enough to make my control slip. But control has limits, and one night I found myself in the fortress monastery's butchery, where food animals were slaughtered and processed for consumption, where blood flowed freely and the scent was overwhelming. I found myself drinking raw blood from the butcher's buckets, gulping it down with desperate hunger, feeling brief satisfaction as the liquid filled my stomach, temporary relief from the craving that had grown too strong to resist. The blood was animal blood, not human, not the blood of enemies or brothers, but in that moment I did not care, cared only about satisfying the hunger that had been building for months. Cade found me there, found me with blood covering my face and hands, with my eyes wild and my breathing ragged, found me in the act of betraying the control I should have maintained. He looked at me for a long moment, his ruined face showing no emotion, and then he spoke quietly, carefully, with the voice of someone who understood what I was experiencing because he had experienced it himself. "We all have our demons, boy," he said softly. The gene seed leaves marks on those it touches and rejects, leaves us with fragments of the curse without the strength to bear it properly. The red thirst haunts many of us, the failed aspirants who carry enough of Sanguinius's legacy to feel the hunger, but not enough of his blessing to control it. You're not the first to find yourself here, won't be the last, and as long as you keep it to animal blood, as long as you don't let it control you during duty hours, as long as you never let the blood angels see this weakness, you'll survive. He helped me clean up, helped me wash the blood from my face and hands, helped me return to my quarters without being seen by anyone who might report what I had done. He never spoke of it again, never used it against me, never mentioned it except in the most oblique ways, but I knew he was watching me, checking that I maintained control, ready to intervene if I crossed the line from managing the curse to being controlled by it. The months became years, the years became routine, the routine became my life, an existence measured in armor maintenance cycles and combat training and personal hours spent watching the angels train. I was 17, then 18, then 19, growing older without growing larger, my body locked in its failed state, unable to age normally because the gene seed material had disrupted my growth patterns, unable to become fully Astartes because the transformation had failed. I existed in a strange middle ground between human aging and transhuman immortality, growing older slowly, maintaining physical capability longer than normal humans, but never approaching the longevity of true blood angels. I heard whispers of the Tower of Amario from other serfs, heard rumors of the Tower of the Lost, where blood angels who succumbed to the Black Rage were kept, where those who could no longer control the death visions were chained in cells until they could be deployed in a final glorious charge. where they would spend their remaining time reliving Sanguinius's death over and over until they were granted the mercy of actual death in battle. Serfs were forbidden from approaching the tower, were told it was sacred ground where only sanguinary priests and chaplains could walk, where the cursed brothers were kept until their final deployment. But I felt drawn to the tower, felt a connection to the brothers who had succumbed to the same curse that touched me during my transformation, felt the need to see what waited for those who could not control the genetic memories, who could not resist the death visions that the gene seed imposed on their minds. During a maintenance shift in the deep levels of the fortress monastery, I found an unsealed passage, found a route that led toward the tower, found myself walking towards something I knew I should avoid but could not resist. The tower held dozens of fallen blood angels, warriors who had served for decades or centuries before the Black Rage took them, brothers who were chained in cells lined with blessed ceramite, who screamed and wept and roared with voices that carried the madness of 10,000 years of genetic memory. Some whispered tactical data from battles fought during the Great Crusade, coordinating attacks on enemies who had been dead for millennia. Others pleaded with ghosts, begged for forgiveness from Horus or the Emperor or Sanguinius himself, relived the Siege of Terra and the battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit with the immediate terror of those who believed it was happening now, in this moment, rather than being ancient history. I watched from the shadows, transfixed by horror and recognition, understanding that these were angels consumed by the very madness that had touched me during my transformation, that they experienced the death of Sanguinius with the same intensity I had felt in my sarcophagus, but they experienced it constantly, endlessly, without relief or respite or hope of recovery. They had been warriors, had been heroes, had served the Emperor and the chapter with distinction, and now they were trapped in their own minds, prisoners of genetic memories they could not escape, waiting only for the final deployment that would grant them the mercy of death in battle. One cell held Brother Valdris, a veteran of 400 years, recently fallen to the Black Rage after serving with distinction in campaigns across the galaxy. His armor was still intact, still marked with honors and purity seals, but his eyes were empty of recognition, filled only with the visions that consumed his mind. He saw me standing outside his cell, and for a moment his eyes cleared, focused on me with an intensity that made me step back, made me question whether I should have come here. "You are one of us," Valdris said, his voice carrying both the depth of an Astartes and the madness of someone who could not distinguish past from present. Not angel, not human, touched by the curse but denied the glory, carrying fragments of Sanguinius in your broken body, while lacking the strength to bear his full blessing. I nodded, unable to speak, unable to deny what he saw in me, what my scars and my malformed body proclaimed to anyone who understood what they were looking at. "Do you know what that makes you, little failed one?" Valdris continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than his earlier words. "You are proof that damnation can be worse than death, that failure can create suffering more complete than any punishment the Emperor might devise. We who fall to the rage will die in glorious battle, will serve one final time, will be remembered as heroes who could not resist the curse. You will live serving, forever reminded of what you cannot be, existing in the shadow of angels without ever achieving their glory, carrying the curse without the compensation of their blessings." He lunged at the bars of his cell then, his eyes losing focus again, his mind returning to the visions that controlled him, and he began screaming in high Gothic, coordinating attacks on the Vengeful Spirit, calling for his battle brothers to rally, to push forward, to save the angel who was dying even as he screamed. I fled, ran from the tower back to the safer areas of the fortress monastery, ran from the truth that Valdris had spoken, ran from the understanding that my existence was a form of damnation worse than what the fallen blood angels experienced. Back in my quarters, I stared at my malformed hands, at the scars from the failed black carapace, at the body that would never be right, that would hurt for the rest of my life, that would remind me every day of what I had tried to become and failed to achieve. I understood then, understood fully and completely, that I carried the curse of the blood angels, but lacked their glory, that I was damned but not blessed, broken but not martyred, existing in a state between human and Astartes that offered me the worst of both conditions and the benefits of neither. I considered ending my life again, found myself holding a razor blade from the armory, considering the quick cut across my wrists or throat that would end the pain and the shame and the constant reminder of failure. But Cade's words echoed in my mind, his insistence that we all serve, that service is all we have, that survival itself is a form of resistance against the universe that wants us dead. I put the blade down, not because the despair went away, but because I'd already made the choice to live, had already committed to service, and changing that choice now would be one final failure, one last betrayal of everyone who had brought me to this point. The alarms began on a Tuesday morning, began with a sound that cut through the fortress monastery like a blade, that sent every serf scrambling to their duty stations, that meant the fortress was under attack or about to be under attack, that meant everything we had trained for was about to be tested. Warp signatures had been detected in system, chaos incursion identified as word-bearers traitor marines seeking to defile the holy ground of Baal itself, seeking to desecrate the fortress monastery and corrupt the gene seed stocks and destroy the sacred legacy of Sanguinius. All blood angels prepared for immediate deployment, moving with efficiency that came from 10,000 years of practice, from countless battles against every enemy the galaxy could produce, from training that had refined their combat capability to perfection. They would intercept the word-bearers in orbit or in the void, would prevent them from landing on Baal if possible, would destroy them in space before they could threaten the fortress monastery itself. But contingencies had to be prepared, defenses had to be manned, because if the blood angels failed in orbit, if the traitors managed to land, if the fortress monastery was breached, then the serfs would be the last line of defense, would hold the sacred halls until the angels could return and cleanse whatever corruption had gained entry. Chapter serfs were called to defensive positions, issued weapons we had trained with but never fired in actual combat, given armor that was better than Imperial Guard standard but still laughably inadequate compared to the power armor we maintained. We received laser guns and carapace armor and grenades and combat knives, received the basic equipment of Imperial infantry with instructions to defend critical locations, to hold key corridors, to die if necessary to buy time for the blood angels to return. Cade gathered those of us assigned to defend the armory approaches, spoke to us with the calm of someone who had seen combat before, who had survived attacks on the fortress monastery in the past, who understood what we were facing. "We are not angels," he said slowly, making eye contact with each of us in turn. "We cannot match traitor Astartes in combat, cannot hope to defeat them through strength or skill or any conventional means. But we can die to give the angels time to return, can sell our lives to protect the sacred war gear, can serve in this final way if service is required." I checked my laser gun with hands that shook despite my best efforts to control them, checked that the power cell was properly seated, that the barrel was clean, that the weapon would fire when I pulled the trigger. I had cleaned these weapons thousands of times, had maintained them and blessed them and prepared them for blood angels to carry into battle, but I had never fired one in anger, never pointed one at a living target, never had to use it to kill. The weight felt wrong in my twisted hands. The balance seemed off because my fingers did not close properly around the grip, but I held it anyway, held it because I had no choice, because my service was required, because this was what I had trained for during all those combat drills. Theron signed to me, his hands moving through the gestures we all understood. "We will not survive this." I signed back, my twisted fingers forming the symbols carefully. "Then we die serving. It is enough. The assault began with drop pods striking the outer defenses, with explosions that rocked the fortress monastery and sent debris falling from the ceiling, with alarms blaring and lights flickering, and the sound of bolter fire in the distance. The word bearers came through breaches in the outer walls, through corridors that should have been sealed, through defensive positions that had been prepared but not properly manned because most of the Blood Angels were in orbit fighting the main Chaos fleet. Cultists swarmed in first, human followers of the Chaos Gods, corrupted and mutated and screaming praises to entities whose names hurt to hear. They wore armor cobbled from scrap and bore weapons that were crude but effective, that fired solid rounds or last bolts or simply swung blades at anything that moved. They came in waves, dozens of them, hundreds, too many to count, flooding through the corridors with the desperate fanaticism of those who believed they were serving divine powers, who thought that dying in this place would grant them eternal reward in realms beyond death. I fired my laser gun, watched last bolts burn through corrupted flesh, watched cultists fall with holes through their torsos, watched them die without understanding why I felt nothing, no triumph, no horror, nothing but mechanical efficiency as I worked the trigger and switched power cells and continued firing. My first kill was a cultist with 3 eyes and tentacles growing from their arms, a human who had been so changed by chaos corruption that their original form was barely recognizable. The last bolt hit them center mass, burned through their chest cavity, dropped them mid-charge, and I felt nothing. Felt only the need to acquire the next target, to continue firing, to hold this position until ordered to withdraw, or until I died holding it. The corridor became a charnel house, became a place where cultists died by the dozens, where serfs fell as well when return fire found them, where Brennus died to a headshot that left his brains splattered across the wall behind him, where Loken was torn apart by a mutant with claws instead of hands, who got inside our line and killed 3 serfs before we brought it down. The fighting was desperate, was chaotic, was nothing like the clean tactical scenarios we had trained for, was blood and noise and terror and the simple mechanical act of pointing weapons and pulling triggers until either the enemy died or we did. Then the Chaos Space Marines came, word-bearers in armor painted crimson like mockery of the Blood Angels, covered in scripture that hurt to read, that seemed to move even when I was not looking directly at it, that proclaimed devotion to dark gods and hatred for the Emperor. They towered over the cultists, moved with the enhanced speed of Astartes, carried bolters that fired explosive rounds that killed with every hit, that turned human bodies into clouds of blood and bone fragments with casual efficiency. Senna died when a bolter round hit her center mass, died instantly, died so completely that there was nothing left to bury, just scattered pieces that had been a person seconds before. The Blood Angels returned fire from defensive positions further back, their bolters speaking with authority, their marksmanship perfect, but there were too few of them. Most of the chapter was still in orbit fighting the main Chaos force, and we were holding with skeleton crews and desperate serfs who had never expected to actually fight Chaos Space Marines. Cade died holding a doorway that led to the armory itself, died buying time for us to evacuate sacred weapons and relics, died with a laser gun in his hands and curses on his lips, died fighting traitors to the Imperium after 50 years of service to the Blood Angels. I watched him fall, watched a word-bearer's champion cut him down with a chainsword that sprayed his blood across the walls, watched the old man who had saved my life die protecting equipment that could be replaced, protecting a door that would eventually be breached anyway. But he had bought us 2 minutes, had delayed the enemy long enough for us to move critical items deeper into the fortress, and 2 minutes was valuable, was worth a life, was the currency we traded when defending sacred ground. Theron died silently as he had lived, died without making a sound because his voice had been taken from him during his failed transformation, died when a bolter round hit him in the chest and destroyed his lungs and heart and spine in a single explosive impact. He had been signing to me seconds before, had been coordinating our movements, had been trying to organize a fighting withdrawal that would save some of us while still holding the critical positions, and then he was dead, was gone, was nothing but a body that would be recovered later if anyone survived to recover bodies. I found myself facing Brother Sorcerer Malakar, a word-bearer's champion whose armor was inscribed with scripture that glowed with unholy light, whose voice carried the authority of someone who had communed with the dark gods directly, who radiated power that made my gene seed fragments scream in recognition and terror. He towered over me, 8 feet of corrupted ceramite and twisted devotion, and he looked at me with eyes that held 10,000 years of service to entities I could not comprehend. "A failed aspirant," he said, his voice distorted by his helmet's Vox system, but still carrying amusement, contempt, something that might have been pity. How fitting that the corpse worshippers deploy their broken cast-offs to defend their halls, that they value sacred ceramite more than human life, that they send you to die rather than risk their precious angels. He stepped forward, casual, not even considering me a threat, not bothering to raise his bolter because killing me with his bare hands would be trivial, would require less effort than swatting an insect. "I can complete what they started," he said, his tone shifting to something that might have been genuine offer or might have been mockery so profound that sincerity was indistinguishable from sarcasm. "The dark gods accept all who serve, do not reject those whose bodies are imperfect, do not care about genetic compatibility or rejection rates. I can make you powerful, can complete your transformation into something beautiful and terrible, can give you strength beyond what you failed to achieve." I raised my lace gun despite knowing it was futile, despite understanding that last bolts would barely scratch his armor, despite the fact that my twisted hands shook and my vision blurred, and I was going to die here, regardless of what I said or did. "I'm a failure," I said through lips that barely worked, through a mouth that had grown wrong during transformation. "But I serve true gods, serve the Emperor who created humanity's greatest champions, serve Sanguinius who died protecting Terra. You serve lies wrapped in power, serve entities that offer strength through corruption, serve false gods who care nothing for their servants beyond what use they can extract before discarding them." I fired the laser gun, knew the last bolt would do nothing, watched it splash against his armor without effect, and prepared to die with my failure complete, but my faith intact. Malakar raised his bolter, pointed it at my head, began the motion that would end my life in an explosive termination of consciousness and suffering and bitter shame. The alarm changed then, changed from defensive warning to triumphant declaration, the sound that meant blood angels were returning, that the orbital battle had been won, that the fortress monastery would be cleansed. Thunderhawks were landing, their engines screaming promises of violence and purification, their passenger compartments filled with angels who had destroyed the Chaos Fleet and were returning to finish what the traitors had started. Brother Sergeant Aramis arrived like an angel of vengeance, like death walking in crimson ceramite, his power sword crackling with energy as he cut down cultists with contemptuous ease. He saw me, saw Malakar about to kill me, saw the situation in an instant of perfect battlefield awareness, and he moved with speed that my eyes could barely track, crossed the distance between us in seconds that felt like frozen time, brought his blessed blade down in an arc that caught Malakar across the torso. The word-bearer's champion tried to block, tried to raise his bolter in defense, but Brother Sergeant Aramis was faster, was better trained, was fighting with 10,000 years of accumulated combat doctrine and personal skill developed across decades of war. The power sword cut through corrupted ceramite like it was paper, through the armor and the flesh beneath, through Malakar's chest cavity and out the other side, and the Chaos Champion fell in 2 pieces that leaked black blood across the floor. Brother Sergeant Aramis stood over me, his crimson armor spattered with enemy blood, his presence so overwhelming that I could not speak, could not move, could only stare up at the being who had saved my life. He looked down at me, his helmet's eye lenses glowing red in the darkness of the corridor, and he spoke with a voice that carried both authority and something that might have been approval. "You have honored the chapter, Serf," he said simply. "Your service is recorded. Your defense of the armory, approaches, prevented the enemy from accessing sacred war gear. Your sacrifice will be remembered among those who died defending this holy place." The words were simple, were basic acknowledgement of duty performed, were nothing extraordinary or profound, but I wept hearing them, wept tears that were half blood, because my tear ducts had been damaged during transformation, wept because a blood angel had seen me, had recognized my service, had said that what I had done mattered. I was alive, was broken, was covered in the blood of enemies and friends, but I had served, had defended the fortress, had proved that even a failed aspirant could contribute to the chapter's glory. The aftermath took weeks to process, took time to recover bodies and repair damage and cleanse the corruption the word-bearers had brought into the fortress monastery. Hundreds of serfs had died defending sacred ground, had given their lives to hold critical positions, had proved that service did not require transformation, that dedication could exist in broken bodies and failed aspirant, and humans who would never be transhuman. The blood angels mourned them alongside the few battle brothers who had fallen, recorded their names in the chapter archives, marked their service with the same honor given to any who died defending Baal. I helped recover bodies of friends who had died beside me, carried Cade's remains to the preparation chamber where they would be blessed before burial, helped gather what pieces of Theron and Senna could be found, helped with the grim work of identifying who had died and who had survived. Each name recorded was a life ended, a service concluded, a person who had mattered even though they had been broken or had failed or had never attempted transformation. They had served, they had died, they had mattered to the chapter even if the chapter rarely acknowledged their existence. I stood in the Hall of Remembrance weeks after the battle, stood among the carved stones that listed names of serfs who had died in defense of the fortress monastery over 10,000 years of chapter history. The names went back to the founding, covered every wall of the massive chamber, recorded tens of thousands of people who had served without becoming blood angels, who had given their lives protecting the fortress, or maintaining the war gear, or defending critical facilities during attacks. Some names had notations beside them, brief descriptions of how they had died or what they had defended. Small acknowledgments that their deaths had meant something beyond simple biological termination. I found Cade's name carved into the stone, found the brief notation, "Died defending the Armorium," found proof that his 50 years of service had been recorded, that his life had mattered enough to warrant permanent memorial. I found Theron's name, found Senna's, found the names of dozens of serfs I had known, had worked with, had shared meals and conversations and quiet moments of understanding with. They were all recorded here, all given the same honor, all acknowledged as having served the chapter with dedication that warranted remembrance. I realized then, standing in that hall, reading those names, that this was the glory available to me, different from the glory of blood angels who soared into battle, but real nonetheless. The glory of those who made the angels possible, who maintained their war gear and defended their fortress and died protecting the sacred legacy of Sanguinius. Not the glory of transhuman warriors smashing the Emperor's enemies, but the glory of support personnel who served without transformation, who gave their lives for a chapter that barely acknowledged their existence, who found purpose in service even though the service was invisible, thankless, conducted entirely in the shadow of beings who had achieved what they could not. Brother Chaplain Serath found me there, his skull helm making him look like death walking, his presence still intimidating despite the fact that he had saved my life by giving me the choice to serve rather than die. He looked at the names carved in stone, looked at me standing among them, and he spoke with a voice that carried both authority and something that might have been compassion, might have been understanding that service took many forms and all were necessary. You could have run during the assault, he said slowly, carefully. Many serfs did, fled to the deep shelters, chose survival over defense, and we do not judge them for it because terror is a reasonable response to facing Chaos Space Marines, because choosing to live is not the same as choosing to betray. You stayed, you fought, you held your position until the Blood Angels returned. Why? I considered the question, considered all the possible answers I could give, considered lies and partial truths and simple evasions. But I was too tired to lie, too exhausted to offer anything but the truth that had sustained me through 3 years of service, 3 years of living in the shadow of angels, 3 years of existing in a body that hurt constantly and reminded me with every breath of what I had failed to become. Because I failed the transformation, I said finally, the words coming slowly, carefully, pulled from the deepest parts of my understanding. But I did not fail the Blood Angels. I did not fail the Emperor. I did not fail the service that Sanguinius demands from all who carry even fragments of his legacy. This is the only way I can serve, the only way I can contribute, the only way I can justify my continued existence in a universe that has no use for the weak or the broken. It is enough. It has to be enough, because it is all I have to give. Brother Chaplain Sereth nodded slowly, his skull helm revealing nothing but his voice carrying approval, carrying recognition that I understood something many did not, that service was not measured in power but in dedication, that the Emperor was served by all who gave their worth from the mightiest Primarch to the lowest serf. You understand what many do not, he said quietly. Power is not the measure of service. Dedication is, and you have proven your dedication through your refusal to abandon your post, through your willingness to die defending our halls, through your acceptance of a life lived in service, even though that life brings you constant pain and constant reminder of failure. He offered me promotion then, offered to make me master of the armory serfs, to give me increased responsibility and authority over other serfs, to recognize my service through elevated position and additional duties. I accepted, not because I wanted authority, but because the offer came from the chaplain, because refusing would be refusing the only reward the chapter could give, because accepting meant acknowledging that my service had value, that even a failed aspirant could contribute in meaningful ways. Weeks later, I stood in the armory, polishing the armor of Brother Sergeant Aramis for his next deployment. My twisted hands moving across the crimson ceramite with practiced efficiency, my fingers finding every scratch and carbon scoring and blessed residue that marked his service to the chapter. My body still hurt, still reminded me with every movement that I was broken, that I would never be what I had tried to become, that I carried the curse of the Blood Angels without their blessings. But the work was meditative, was purposeful, was concrete contribution to the chapter's ability to wage war against the Emperor's enemies. I whispered prayers as I worked, prayers to the Emperor, prayers to Sanguinius, prayers that acknowledged what I was and what I could never be. Emperor, I am not what I wished to be. I am not the angel I tried to become. I'm not the warrior I dreamed of being when I drank from the red grail and felt your divine essence burning through my veins. But I am what you need me to be. I am the servant who maintains the armor of your champions. I am the defender who holds the fortress when your angels march to war. I am the failed aspirant who found purpose in service, even though that service brings constant pain and constant reminder of failure. Let this service be enough. Let this dedication justify my existence. Let this contribution matter, even though it is small and invisible and conducted entirely in shadow. I caught my reflection in the polished ceramite, saw my malformed face, saw my twisted hands, saw the scars from the failed black carapace that covered my torso in irregular patterns of hardened tissue. I was hideous, was broken, was a failed experiment in transformation, was everything I'd never wanted to become. But my eyes held determination, held purpose, held the understanding that I had found meaning in a life that most would consider not worth living. I am Dren, I thought, the internal monologue forming words I would never speak aloud. I failed to become a blood angel. I am deformed. I am weak compared to the angels I serve. I will never soar into battle or know the glory of the transhuman warrior or experience the satisfaction of crushing the Emperor's enemies with my own hands. But I serve. I maintain their armor. I defend their fortress. I preserve their legacy through small acts of dedication performed every day without recognition or reward. I live in the shadow of angels, and in that shadow I have found my purpose, have found the only meaning available to someone who tried for greatness and achieved only survival. I'm a chapter serf of the Blood Angels, and that is enough, has to be enough, will be enough until the day I die, serving in the shadow of beings who achieved what I could not. It is not the life I wanted, not the glory I dreamed of when I stood in the wastes of Baal Secundus and watched the Thunderhawks descend from the stars. But it is the life I have. It is the service I can give. It is the purpose that justifies my continued existence in a universe that measures worth in violence and power in the capacity to destroy the Emperor's enemies. I polish the armor. I maintain the war gear. I defend the fortress when defense is required. And I serve, every day, every hour, every breath, in the shadow of angels who remind me constantly of what I failed to become. And that service, humble and invisible and conducted entirely in darkness, is enough.